Okay, I think we're going to try and be on time. So, welcome everyone to the CSPS seminar series. My name is Dr. Ajwa Ebwajapong, and I'm the seminar coordinator. This afternoon, we have with us Professor Anyidoho, Professor Mike Rogan, and Florian Jürgen Grant. They'll be giving us a presentation on taxation and social protection in Accra's informal economy. So they'll be looking at the extent to which informal workers have access to social protection and have benefited from COVID-19 relief programs. They'll also look at the tax burdens of informal workers in Accra. Professor Anyidoho is an associate professor in social policy and social development at ISE, and also the director of CSPS. Prof. Mike Rogan is a research associate in the Urban Policies Program at WIGO, that is Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. And the same with Florian Jürgen Grant, who is also a social protection specialist on the same project. So I'll welcome the team to do the presentation within 30 minutes, and then we would allow for Q&A. Thank you very much, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Ajwa. So I'm going to start off, and then Mike will come in, and then Florian will take us to the finish line. This is a project, it's a rather big project, long-term project that we are still on, and it involves a number of people beyond those of us doing the presentation today. We also have colleagues, Max Gallian from the ICTD, which is the International Center for Tax and Development. He's also at the Institute of Development Studies. And then there's Vanessa van den Bogard, who is at ICTD and University of Toronto. And then we have Gita Ismail, who is at WIGO with Mike and Florian. So this is our topic: tight tax nets, loose safety net, taxation in Ghana's informal economy. We want to give you a little background about the project, talk to you about the methods that we used and the data that we have, and then the results we want to show cover COVID and social protection, and then taxation, and then we'll have some final reflections on the so what of it all. So the background is that everywhere in the world, COVID-19 presented and still presents two challenges for us. How do we provide social protection for the many people who have either fallen into vulnerability or whose vulnerabilities have deepened as a result of the pandemic, which, as we know, is not just a health issue, but has become a livelihood issue, an issue of housing, an issue of social marginalization. It's been sort of a cluster of a confluence of different crises that have sort of interacted and accumulated, and which have affected people who are already vulnerable. So in a way, COVID has highlighted the limits of our social protection by presenting us with a crisis that has deepened vulnerabilities beyond what our existing social protection systems and structures have been able to deal effectively with. And then at the same time, because of the widened and deepened needs of people, as well as what the pandemic did to the economy, there is the challenge of doing revenue mobilization. As I said, this is a global problem, but it has peculiar and perhaps more expansive implications for countries like Ghana in the global south, whose economies are largely informal. So it's presented us with a greater challenge of social protection for many workers, the majority of workers in the informal economy, whose livelihoods have been very much challenged, and has also presented us with a challenge of how do you do revenue mobilization effectively when you do have the majority of your workers in the informal economy. This is particularly true of our context where there is the perception that informal workers are outside of the tax net. So there's been greater policy discourse, sort of louder voices in the policy realm, talking about how we need to bring informal workers within the tax net. There's pushback on the other hand of people saying that already informal workers are burdened, are overburdened, disproportionately burdened in terms of payments that they make, and that there should be caution in trying to bring them further within the tax net or to try to deepen the burdens on them. The problem is that this policy discourse does not have a lot of empirical evidence to help us to make the right decisions. We don't know enough about the tax payments that informal workers make. And given how recent the COVID pandemic particularly has been, we don't yet have sufficient evidence on the extent to which social protection systems have been able to support and help from informal workers. So this is really where our study comes in, to try to provide evidence on both the tax burdens of informal workers as well as on their access to social protection, to see where we can find a balance, to have a sense of which way are we going. Are informal workers paying enough, and are they getting enough, really is the question. So as I mentioned, this is an ongoing project. We have survey data already, but we want to go further to do more qualitative work, which we have begun. But given the data that we have collected, we feel like we have enough to be able to say something useful in answer to this question. So the survey that we collected was done obviously with ICTD and WeGo, but also using the ESA survey unit. We did a two-stage cluster sampling to get us to 2,700 informal workers in Accra, who are made up of street vendors, market traders, and home-based workers. Just to explain a little bit more, market traders we classify as those who are working within identified markets, who are often members of associations of the market. Street vendors tend to work outside of these designated markets, often close to markets, sometimes not. And then we have home-based workers who do informal work from within their homes or very, very close to their homes. We collected this data in April, May of 2022, just at the cusp of the e-levy, which we all know in Ghana is a very significant tax for all of us. And we argue, especially for informal workers, the implication for them are deep. So we are able to present some data about the likely effects of this particular tax, as well as other taxes on these categories of informal workers in Accra. And at this point, I'll hand over to Mike to take us through the results of the survey data.
Great. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. Am I audible before I start?
Yes, you
Yes.
are.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thanks. And Nana, would you mind shifting through the slides for me? Yeah, great. Thank you. So we thought we'd sort of present the key results in sort of two parts, logically following on from the introduction. The first part, we talk about what we find that informal workers get, not just for the taxes that they pay, but what they get in terms of social protection. I would pause for just a moment to say, we're going to just skim through some of the main findings, but we have published this as a WeGo working paper. So if you go to the WeGo website, you can find all of these results and more, as well as more detail on how the study was conducted. But to start with, the good news, probably not a surprise to people in this particular meeting. Ghana has a flagship national health program. Informal workers are able to opt in, and as you can see from the slides here, the vast majority of our sample, which, as Nana mentioned, is representative of the Accra metropolitan area, are enrolled in the NHIS. Maybe I'll just say a thing or two about the graph in front of you, since we present quite a few of our results this way. We've broken up the sample into earnings quintiles. So that's what those. Quintile 1 is the lowest earning group of our sample, and so on up to quintile 5, which is the highest earning. I would say that earnings are fairly highly concentrated in Accra's informal sector. There aren't massive differences between earnings, but quintile 5 certainly earns quite a bit more than quintile 1, for example, in terms of average earnings. So the other thing you can notice from this graph is that women in Accra's informal sector are considerably more likely to be registered with the NHIS, and in particular, 73% of the lowest earning women are enrolled, whereas just about half of men, if you look across those earnings deciles, are enrolled in the NHIS. So as usual, there's something of a success story, I think we would suggest, when it comes to health protection in Accra. Next, please. The not so good news is access to the pension, or any pension for that matter. We asked several questions in the survey about access to a pension or contributions to a pension. And among those who did contribute to some sort of retirement savings, the vast majority contributed to the national pension program, the SSNIT. But as you can see from this graph, very few informal workers, or the majority of informal workers, don't contribute to the pension. And there's a surprisingly large gender difference here. Men are roughly twice as likely to belong to the pension, but still only about a fifth of men, or slightly less than a fifth of men in the informal sector in Accra contribute to this pension. Women less than 10%. So very little coverage in terms of old age savings or funds for retirement in the informal sector. Next, please. And now, of course, the really bad news. It's interesting when I've presented these sort of headline results in South Africa, where people aren't as familiar with the context in Ghana. One of the questions I often get is, what business support do workers in the informal sector in Ghana get? And in particular, what support did they get during COVID? As most, if not all of you will be aware, the single largest program to support the informal sector, or SMMEs in general, was called CAPBUS, although our survey asked a number of questions about other social protection programs or emergency programs, and very few of those had any type of coverage. By far the largest coverage was CAPBUS, which is not surprising, but the coverage there is very disappointing. So those blue bars that you can see there represent the percentage of each earnings quintile that applied for the CAPBUS program, which was basically a package of support in the form of a soft loan to sort of hold small businesses over. Women and the informal sector were the stated policy targets of this program, but as you can see, all across the quintiles, less than 20% even applied. Most people responded that they hadn't heard of the program or found the application process too cumbersome, or perhaps even that they didn't think that they would be likely to receive funds. So those blue bars suggest that particularly amongst the lowest earning workers, only about 12% even bothered to apply. Those red bars, which are very visible at the bottom, is the percentage of each quintile that received any type of funding support through the CAPBUS program. So across the sample, about 1.5% of all informal sector operators in Accra received CAPBUS support. And as you can see, amongst the lower quintiles, it was far less than 1%. So really disappointing that in a context where 90% of the workforce is informal, informal sector operators were left almost entirely out of the main COVID support package for MSMEs. Thanks. Right, so against that context of, I think we perhaps agree, mixed news, good news on the health front, but COVID relief or business support, we asked the question, what do informal workers contribute in taxes and in particular specific types of operating fees? So our conservative estimate is that almost exactly 2/3 of informal sector operators contribute to at least one type of tax or fee payment, the recipient largely being the Accra Municipal Assembly, the AMA, or Ghana Revenue Authority. But no matter which type of payment we examine, and we collated quite a few in our survey, all of them are highly regressive, simply meaning that the rate of payment as a relative to earnings tends to be higher or much higher amongst the lower earning groups, which violates one of the key principles of fair and of fair taxation. Next, please. So we can group these, and there's a text box in our working paper which explains exactly which payments are clustered under each broad category. But if we start with business license and operating paid to the AMA, and the amounts tend to vary based on the activity and the or turnover or the size of the informal firm. And what you're looking at here is the share of gross monthly earnings that's paid towards this particular group of payments. So we've aggregated the different types of payments into this category. And two things should be obvious. The first is that for both women and men, this payment is again highly regressive. The lowest earning quintile for both women and men pay far more than the next highest earning quintile. So this is more than double in the case of the distribution of payments among women. And amongst men, the lowest earning group pays about 4 times as much as the next lowest earning group. So if you look at the left of your screen there, you'll see that the lowest earning group of men in the informal sector pay about 4% of their monthly earnings alone, just in these types of fees and payments. It's important to mention here that these figures are not conditional on paying these fees. So we include people who haven't paid in this calculation as paying 0. So if we were to narrow in on the groups of informal workers who pay these specific types of fees, you would see the share of their income goes up by quite a bit. So this is a fairly conservative estimate of the informal sector as a whole. Next, please. This is another group of payments. These are what we're referring to as formal taxes. These are things that have the word tax in their name and are part of statutory obligations to either the local municipality or the Ghana Revenue Authority. So this is what people often have in their minds when we say tax. These are sort of formal types of tax payments. And this is relates to the first slide where we, actually that was from a presentation I gave the other day, about 37% of the entire sample pays some type of formal tax to either the GRA or the AMA. So you can see amongst women, these types of taxes, not conditional on paying them, make up about 4% of monthly earnings amongst the lowest earning group. And again, this would be much higher if we just looked at those people who pay these particular taxes. Highly regressive structure for both women and men. These tax rates are sort of the opposite of the way the standard formal tax system is generally structured. So they're progressive in nature. There's another group of fees which are quite particular to the informal sector. These are user fees and informal taxes. User fees relate to a number of different types of things. Again, we list them in the working paper. But anytime you need to pay some type of fee to access infrastructure, storage, market space, anything to do with transport or vehicles, often involves some type of user fee. And informal taxes take up a range of different types of payments, from bribes on the one hand, to payments to traditional authorities in the case of some markets. About 16% of our sample of informal sector operators in Accra pay at least one type of user fee just to operate their business. So these are fees specifically related to the operation of the business. These are different types of operating costs. It's probably important to note that out of this, we've excluded service fees. If we include them, about 95% of our sample pay some type of basic service fee while at work. So if it's a market vendor, it's at the market. Street vendors for access to sanitation and water and electricity while at work. And these are very expensive costs. And I would suggest, and those of you in Ghana would probably agree, that this makes up a lot more now than it did when we were in the field a year ago. Inflation has been remarkably high in Ghana, as you all know. But at the time of our survey, just these payments for basic service fees at work made up about 10% of the earnings in the lowest quintile of workers. Next, please. Right, so just a couple slides to pull it all together. If we aggregate these different groups of payments, the user fees, the licenses and permits, and the formal taxes, and express that as a share of gross monthly earnings, this is what happens to the overall structure of these payments. You'll see that it's quite similar for women and men as a share of earnings and as a structure across the distribution, but again, highly regressive. Women pay about 9% of their monthly earnings towards these types of fees and taxes, and men pay about 10%. And again, it's worth emphasizing that we include the entire sample in these calculations. So those that don't pay any of these types of fees, that 1/3 we mentioned earlier, their values are expressed as 0. If we focus in on workers who pay some of these, at least one of these types of fees, obviously the share of income that's spent on these types of payments is much, much higher. So this is sort of a conservative estimate, and of course the structure is clearly unsustainable. Right, 2 more slides from me before we hand over to Florian. So the real value of a study like this that's representative of a segment of the workforce is that you get a perspective on how all these different fees stack up on top of one another. It's really difficult to get this information from any other source, of course, because the fees are paid to different actors, and most labor force type surveys or firm surveys aren't specific enough to collect this information. So what we've got in this slide are each of the fees, or the groups of fees and taxes that we've measured and discussed here, expressed as a percentage of gross monthly earnings, arranged by the earnings quintiles and sort of stacked up. So you can see what the overall contribution to these payments is. If we look at the lowest earning quintile again, that overall regressivity is pretty clear from this graph. But what you can see is the 2 largest groups of payments are formal taxes, which are about 4.1% of total monthly earnings, followed by these scheduled license and operating fees and permits, which make up about 2.6%. And then user fees come in on top of that. You'll see that the slightly less than expected prevalence of informal taxes in Ghana compared to some of the other contexts where our tax team has done a similar survey. But again, this makes up about 9% of conservatively of total earnings from a pretty vulnerable group of workers in the informal sector. And by the way, when we map the distribution of earnings onto the GRA's tax tables, the lowest earning quintile maps almost perfectly onto the tax-free or the tax-exempt portion of the tax table. They're not meant to pay any taxes, but as you can see, a very conservative estimate suggests that they pay about 10% even before we get to services and other types of operating costs. But as we get closer towards the higher end of the distribution, you can see that user fees become a larger portion than these taxes, because they're typically flat rates, tend to make up a smaller portion, which is obviously a feature of their regressivity. And then the final slide on tax and fee payment before I hand over is to really appreciate that within each quintile, there's quite a bit of variation. So what we're looking at here is, again, the male and female samples, women and men, organized according to their earning quintiles. And then we look at the range of different type of payments expressed as a share of monthly earnings. So if we just look at the far left for a moment, quintile 1 for the male sample there, we can see at the median, men pay about somewhere around 12 or 13% of their earnings in these taxes and fees that we've described. But at the 75th percentile, that goes up to about 25%. So quite a bit of variation in the level or share of earnings that are paid to these types of taxes, even within the quintiles. And then the T-bars that go all the way to the top show the maximum range. So in the lowest earning quintile amongst men, there was at least one observation that paid close to 50% of his earnings in these taxes and fees. And then if you look at the corresponding quintile amongst women, you can see that share goes up to 50%. So really an extreme amount of variation even within that lowest earning quintile, with some workers paying upwards of 20% or more of their earnings in these fees and taxes. And of course, it becomes less severe as we move towards the higher earning quintiles. The distributions become much more compact, and the levels of contributions become lower. So that's what we found from our survey data. Happy to discuss some more in question time, and of course, we hope you'll be interested in the working paper. But let me hand over to Florian to kind of summarize the takeaways from all of this.
Thanks, Mike. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay, right. So following Mike's very clear and structured and kind of, data-driven presentation, I'm going to just ramble a little bit and share some general reflections. As I think, as it was said early on, I work in the social protection team, in kind of WIGO's global social protection team. So I'll try to put what we've learned here in Ghana and Accra in a kind of global perspective, and what I think of it. So it's, as Mike said, it's really great to have this kind of data, because we often don't have that, kind of detailed information. But I think what we're seeing does fit into a global picture, and you can kind of relate it to conversations that are happening at the global level, and I'm assuming maybe in Ghana as well. And one of the issues is informal workers being in what's called the missing middle of social protection. So they are de jure or de facto, for various reasons, generally in many countries, in many low and middle income countries in particular, excluded from social protection systems. So they're not destitute enough to have maybe too much labor capacity. They're working poor, if we can say that. So they're excluded from the cash assistance. The LEAP maybe in Ghana is one program, but that's something we see in many countries. They're not considered deserving or worthy or too wealthy maybe for direct investments, income transfers. At the same time, because they're informally employed and don't have are not part of formal standard labor employment relationships, they're excluded from many social insurance programs. So I think that's what we've seen in Accra. I think reflects a global picture on the difficulty that many countries face in expanding social protection to informal workers. And it's also something we've seen during COVID. And what I find fascinating is that, that essentially informal workers weren't able to access the COVID relief programs programs, but not for lack of trying. The number of people who applied, even in the poorest quintiles, informal workers, it's quite astonishing. I think there's 18% of the poorest informal workers who filled out applications. I don't know the details, but they must have filled out some kind of applications online or in paper. Like, that's not easy. And, oftentimes there's talk about, lack of information, or people don't know. And, the fact that they tried and just didn't, essentially whoever made the decision said, no, you cannot have these programs, I think tells us something about the need to design these relief schemes in a way that makes them more accessible for the people that they're intending or to serve. So I think that's really interesting, just from a kind of COVID relief perspective. Talking a little bit more about, I guess, social insurance schemes. So moving away from the cash assistance, it is really interesting that the National Health Insurance, has been relatively successful in reaching large, not all, and it would be interesting to know actually whether the 60-70%, and Mike might know this, whether they're the better off informal workers or whether it's kind of across the board within the informal sector. But the fact that so many informal workers are reached by those schemes, I think it tells us something that you can indeed design schemes to reach informal workers. They just have to be accessible, they have to be affordable, and they have to provide a service or a benefit that is valued by workers, right? So I think there is a positive story here, and I think that's really interesting because there is this global debate that is quite polarized. On the one hand, you have, say, the World Bank that says, sorry, we just can't do these programs. You could do them maybe in 1950s, 60s in Europe where people are formally employed, but in developing countries, everything is too complicated, too much informality. Essentially, these models just don't work, and we need to essentially give up on those, implement a kind of more regressive taxes, a VAT, do a little bit more social assistance, and then kind of more individual responsibility, individual privatized savings account. So that's one side of the argument. On the other hand, you have organizations like the International Labour Organization in particular saying, no, we can actually adapt those schemes to make them more relevant for sorry, I'm loving Mike's cat on screen just now. So you can actually adapt these systems, but it's similar to the debate around maybe taxation. We're talking in these two different camps without really understanding the actual realities on the ground and the nuances there. So, for instance, seeing now that with the NHIS, people generally seem to have enrolled, but we have much lower rates of enrollment with the pension schemes. And even less enrollment with COVID relief. I feel like those facts can tell us something about how to design social protection schemes for informal workers. And I think I don't have the answers, but looking at, well, clearly something worked with the health scheme. Well, what is it that worked? Is it the enrollment system? Is it particularly easy? Is it particularly affordable? I know it's quite subsidized, and this is something we're seeing a lot in many countries that. And I think it's also coming out of this survey here. People don't make a lot of money, already pay a fair amount of taxes, often quite regressive. Affordability of social insurance, on the health side, but also kind of pension insurance, unemployment, the whole social insurance. That costs a lot of money. A lot of people can't afford that. So is the reason why the NHS is such a success is because it is relatively subsidized? Maybe. And likewise, why did, it'd be really interesting, and it's good to hear that they will do some qualitative research, like why did the COVID relief not work? It would be interesting to talk to policymakers, whoever made those decisions. Were the forms not filled out correctly, or was it maybe just not the real target group? And, the policy statement wasn't a true reflection of who the real intention of reaching was, I think. So that's super interesting. But, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit. But, I do think that the health system shows that if people value schemes, if they're accessible and affordable, then people do want to join. But the affordability challenge is there. In global, a lot of countries face, I guess, similar challenges. COVID's been incredibly hard on public finances, on workers' earnings. There are huge coverage gaps in social protection. So at the same time, there's a growing need and appreciation of social protection amongst workers. Like, people have lost a lot, and I think are now to a greater extent saying, no, we need those protections. So the pressures, I think, on governments are real and they're difficult. And I'm not saying I have the answer. So I think the narratives around a gold mine, about an untaxed informal sector, and about this being the answer to financing social protection in low middle income countries is definitely there. And, I think what we're seeing here is that is, maybe it's not too many double negatives. Maybe it's not the answer. Maybe it's partially the answer, but it's certainly not the entire answer. The money just isn't there necessarily, or at least for a large part. There was an opening question whether people are paying enough, and I think most people are, but whether they're getting enough, no, I don't think they're getting enough. They're not getting social protection as they should, and I think that also has an interesting reflection on kind of a social contract issue. People generally are paying taxes. These are not understood and recognized, and services aren't provided in kind of compensation to those. And I think that's a real problem. Yeah, so I think that's just kind of what I wanted to say. Yeah, I think just kind of concluding, like these taxes are highly regressive. Social protection financing, I think it's not. I don't think we can expect most of those informal workers to both pay highly regressive taxes, full social security contributions, and have enough money to live on. So something has to give. We need initial financing from somewhere else. This could be better off members of society. Could be other forms of maybe wealth taxes or whatever it is. But surely we need more than what's there, and we need really be mindful of, I think, tax levels that people have in the discussion on financing, but we really, really need to be mindful of affordability issues. So I think that's a crucial debate on how to make schemes affordable for people. So I think there's more we can learn from Ghana's example. And I think that's just what I wanted to close on. So it's highly relevant for the, I think, global social protection discussion. I've been talking about the study a lot the last couple of weeks because it's just so refreshing when you have these broad statements about, oh yeah, we can kind of tax those guys, to say, well, I might not have the answer, but at least it's not that easy. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, team. Thanks, Florian, Mike, and Anekia, for your presentation. This is very interesting, and to know that it's not a hidden gold mine of unpaid taxes. I think this is very interesting for me. So now we are going to open up for the discussions. You can show a reaction by raising a hand, or send a message in the chat, and then I would read. So let's see if there are any hands up now. But maybe before that, I would want to know a little bit more about the methodology for this research. Maybe just a bit of an overview, because I think asking questions about taxes to informal workers is almost always quite tricky, Yeah, sometimes I'm not sure. Sometimes I think the questions about what is a tax or what is not a tax, and if they even remember, and even their own incomes also. So I'll be happy to know if you can take us through a bit about the methodology.
I think this is a Mike question or somebody else. Just very quickly, I thought it was really hilarious when he was saying it's a tax when it says a tax, when it has the name, when it has the word tax in it. I thought that was quite funny. That really helped me, but over to somebody else.
Should I take this one, Nana, or do you want to start?
Yes, you start and then I'll come in.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, obviously the two of the things that are most crucial to measure are earnings and tax payments, right? Without measuring those two things well, this wouldn't be a very sort of useful exercise. Yeah, those of you who have kind of been following the development literature will know that for years people were telling us we can't capture earnings in developing countries. It's not possible, right? That's actually the source of a lot of the measures of subjective well-being and subjective poverty that are also still popular in the literature. But it turns out over the years, we found that with various types of survey instruments, we can actually pick up earnings if we ask the question the right way. And Ghana, together with actually a number of the Francophone West African countries, are kind of sort of leaders on the continent in measuring earnings. So we, and I think to a large extent, the statistical agency in Ghana follow the World Bank living standard measurements guidelines. Were crucial in pioneering the 1, 2, 3 surveys, which are the spin-offs from the labor force surveys, in order to measure earnings and livelihoods in the informal sector. So we really followed a fairly well-trodden path in terms of the Ghana household surveys that ask questions on earnings. And you would expect Ghana to be quite good at that, because if you ask about earnings in a Ghanaian household survey, you're going to be asking about earnings in the informal sector, since 90% of people work there. So we tested and looked at a number of different questions from the labor force survey, the GLSS, and just made sure that we got that earnings question as precise as possible. And then, of course, having some confidence in the fact that that question has been asked successfully in Ghana for many years. The more difficult part is getting the wording right of the different payments that people made. And of course, with each payment, there's a different battery of follow-up questions, because these payments are made to different agencies for different reasons. Sometimes there are published schedules of how much people are supposed to pay. Other times there's just an informal understanding of what the cost is. Other times it's built into the name. The daily toll is paid daily, and the amount is 1 cedi. So there's very little paperwork on this, but a fairly well understood sort of structure. But we had a lot of expertise on the team. We have colleagues from the ICTD who have been asking these questions about informal sector taxation around the world in some of Ghana's neighboring countries. And then we spent 2 weeks in Ghana piloting and doing focus group workshops with different wordings of the questions to make sure that we got the language as precise as possible. I don't think we got it perfect, but the patterns we've seen in the data are consistent with the expectations we had for different payments, the prevalence of payments. So, I think we've done a fairly reasonable job. We haven't had too many moments where we regretted a particular question or wording of a question. Of course, we've had some ideas of how we do things better in the future, but it was really a fairly meticulous process to ask those 2 sets of questions, earnings and tax payments. And of course, not to leave anything out, because if you leave something out, you skew your estimates of what people are contributing to the fiscus by however much they paid that tax that you didn't ask about. But yeah, I would say now that there's a sort of collection of survey instruments or modules on taxation. The Afrobarometer is another one, of course. So there's a path that can be followed, and I think with just a bit of application, you can adapt survey instruments to capture this type of information. Although it is difficult, it's not the same as asking someone about their salary from a formal employer, which is the same every month.
And just to add on, just an addendum, we also went back. So a couple of weeks ago, we did validation, and with informal workers to say, okay, so these are the figures that we are getting. Does that seem about right? Is that about how much you're paying? And generally they went, yeah, and actually a little more now, given, what has happened with the economy and with inflation since we did the survey in May. So that also gives us the confidence that we got it just about right.
Thank you very much for the responses. I see James and then Harry afterwards with your questions, please. James, are you there? You can ask your question, please. Yeah.
Are you able to unmute?
Otherwise, if Harry is ready, Harry can start and then James can come in later.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good evening and hello, I'm from India. Like, I wanted to ask this, like the presentation talked about the design of the scheme and design of the relief scheme. So I wanted to ask related to that whether I mean, like this was seen across across the world that the relief schemes were not able to address the needs of the informal workers. So, can we draw a conclusion based on this that it is due to the lack of understanding of state and government about the informal economy as such that the relief schemes were poorly designed because the invisibility, I mean, the vulnerability was also due to the state's approach of seeing formal as superior and informal were continuously undervalued. So, I mean, can we critique these responses of the government as states' own notion about informality? I hope I got the question right. Yeah.
Thank you, Harry. Please, you can come in with a response before I go to James.
Well, I can say a bit about that. I think it was alluded to. Now I can't remember whether it was Florian or Mike, but I think, yes, Mike said it in passing that it was partly the design. So the requirements, well, first of all, the fact that you have to have this application, it's online and so on. Some from the focus group discussions we had with the validation, some people actually joined market associations so that they would have support and help to do the application. So there was some concerted effort by some market associations to try and help their members to apply, which was obviously a good thing, but also showed that people needed help to put this application together. And then the requirements, for instance, that you sign up for a tax number, tax identification number, that you show some kind of record of taxes or income. Already you can tell that these are going to be immediate barriers to a lot of people in informal work to have to produce these kinds of formal documents that they might not have had. So in principle, at least discursively, the government actually said we want to make sure that this money is accessible to informal workers and particularly to women and women informal workers. So there was that, or women-owned businesses and informal businesses. So they talk the talk, but whether not whether, it is clear that the design was not exactly friendly to the people that they claim to want to attract as well. Whether this was intentional lack of knowledge or just lack of thoughtfulness or what, that I can't really tell.
If I can maybe just add to that, it was also just, I mean, thinking back like 2.5 years ago, it was a difficult challenge, you know, this thing just kind of happened. The systems weren't in place, and this is one of the takeaways, the systems weren't in place to identify and reach people, and essentially overnight, governments had to design systems to reach, you know, like masses of people, identify, determine who is, you know, deserving, who isn't, who should get what support. So just the logistical challenge, I think, is substantive. I think there was a lot of lack of consideration paid on the lack of understanding and on the realities of informal workers, you know, kind of work and abilities to document stuff. But at the same time, at least globally, so every country did something similar, like Ghana. You know, there were these, I think there's about what is it, like 4,000 global efforts to, some are more straightforward cash transfers, others are kind of more business loans and schemes. So there's a wide variety of, and there's also been a lot of innovation in trying to simplify those to allow informal workers to access that. So I think this is the first time that there was a real global effort to try to reach informal workers, and obviously it had very different outcomes, in different contexts. But it's also just been difficult, I think, So just to add that.
All right, thank you very much. I'm wondering if James still wants to come in. James, are you there? Okay, so maybe let's see if others will have more questions. But I was also wondering, so I think that you make comparisons between the SNIT pension scheme and then the NHIS. But I think the NHIS is a more universal policy, and I think it's not only for the informal economy. So, and I know maybe from my own understanding of the SNIT scheme, most of the times people who find themselves benefiting or contributing are those who are actually in the formal sector. So a lot of informal workers are not even aware they can even make these contributions on their own. And I think that is also monthly as compared to the NHIS premium. So I'm wondering why you do that comparison, and maybe if you can elaborate more on that kind of comparison between the SNIT and the NHIS. I mean, in relation to the social protection, mechanism for the informal workers.
I'm happy to respond, and then maybe other colleagues want to come. I think we weren't necessarily planning on comparing the two. I think we just want to see what's there, what do informal workers contribute to. Pensions tend to be very difficult in many contexts, particularly if they're voluntary. Like retirement always feels very, very far away. Needs tend to be quite pressing in the here and now. And particularly, and I think this is one of the real shortcomings of those voluntary schemes where, you can opt in. Few people do that, I think, and do it consistently, as you need to. So there's, and that's why I think that's why I personally don't think the answer to Social Security and old age in the informal sector are these kind of voluntary schemes you can opt in if you want to. I think that's too difficult for people to maintain coverage. And at the same time, if you want to have enough money to retire on that, you need to pay quite a lot into those schemes, and people cannot realistically afford that. So there needs to be some form of cross-subsidization, and that's why we need public, universal schemes where everybody pays into, and then you just kind of redistribute a little bit within those. It's just, retirement feels far away for many people.
I'm excited my MA students are here because just yesterday we were talking about social protection and different types of social protection, and Florian used some of the concepts that we discussed. So you have social assistance that comes in when you already are in a situation and can try to help you. And then you have more, preventative measures like social insurance that tries to prevent you from getting into, vulnerable situations. And as he said, it's not a comparison, but it's seeing what are the range of social protection responses that are there. And social assistance is one thing, but also the more long-term preventative one. And unfortunately, the only thing that we have that has any real credibility is SNIT. But as you have pointed out, it's not, despite the stated intent and the desire of the program to reach out to informal workers, its coverage is not deep, and that's obviously a concern. And it does beg the question: can we do something else that might be more relevant to the needs and to the situations of informal workers?
All right, thank you very much, Nanekia. MA Program Coordinator, I know you, so I'll mention your name. Please come in. And then after you, Rita can also come in, and then we can take the responses together.
Okay, thank you very much, coordinator, seminar coordinator. So you find out that the informal tax is regressive. Then what should you do?
to put it bluntly.
That's my question.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kojopoku. Rita Amankwa.
Yes, thank you very much. I have enjoyed the presentations and talking about informal sector. Early last year, the Ministry of Gender through the Social Protection Directorate was trying to set up a subcommittee on informal sector and social insurance scheme under the National Technical Committee on Social Protection. They have Intersectorial Technical Committee on Social Protection, and under that there are thematic areas. And so the Ministry of Gender set up, inaugurated a committee on social protection, social insurance. Remember that I chaired the first meeting, and the stakeholders in that sector were so about that. What was missing in that is a leadership. They want sort of leadership to pull the stakeholders together to tackle this issue about social security and the informal sector. And so I think that going forward, that's the Ministry of Gender through the Social Protection Directorate and through that committee needs support in order to be able to discuss and articulate and come out with strategic or sort of a way forward on this. One of the key outcomes of that first meeting was to do a study on social security and informal sector, and to sort of map up the intervention, private and public interventions going on, and to see how best those in the informal sector can be mobilized to contribute to social security for their future use. And so I will suggest to Madam Prof. Akua that they need to support that ministry in terms of, for instance, we even got funding from the World Bank to do the study. And I left there last year, June, and I also even did terms of reference for that study for them. But I haven't heard anything about it since I left in June last year. And I think that you are in the position to push for this to be done. I think that if that is done, it will go a long way to help to mobilize the informal sector stakeholders to enjoy social security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita. So we'll take these as the last two questions, and even as we hear the feedback from our presenters.
Well, I think Dr. Uswa Mankwas was a comment and is well noted. I think that is very important and certainly something doable. So thank you. I'm leaving the more difficult question of what do we do? Our public tax experts, Kojopoku asked. So Mike and Florian, over to you.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I don't think you could put the question any better than that, right? That is the question. So as it turns out, in the first week of April, we've got a joint webinar where we're presenting slightly different. Can you hear me? I got muted there. Yeah, we're presenting this work with the OECD, who have just released a working paper. Happy to share it if anyone's interested. where they've consolidated lessons from presumptive tax regimes from about 50 countries into a framework, and they've developed a list of 50 best practices. And so often there's a trade-off with presumptive tax regimes, which are any type of flat rate, and anytime you have a flat rate, you're going to have regressivity in the structure of your taxes. That means there's a trade-off in how technical the design has to be versus the width of coverage of your targeted tax. So in a case like Ghana, where 90% of the workforce would fall under some sort of presumptive tax regime, it probably means that the GRA has to put more time into the design to think through what the rules would be for different segments of the informal sector, what the coverage would be, what the rates of pay would be. And one of their key recommendations is you absolutely have to understand the local context in terms of what people pay in local fees and taxes before you levy a national flat rate tax. That's how you get presumptive or regressive taxes piled on top of regressive taxes, which are of course unsustainable. So the answer is probably a bit unsatisfactory because it means there's quite a bit more work to do for a context like Ghana to get the right balance between covering as many workers as possible, but also having a more equitable tax structure. One of the interesting suggestions is that perhaps technology has a role to play in this. If it can be made into a useful tool, both for compliance, ease of compliance from the perspective of taxpayers, but also some transparency in the design of the tax so that lower earning workers know that they're not paying a higher share of their income or earnings relative to better off workers, as we had in the top quintile of our analysis. So it's a technical, quite finicky approach that's required, which doesn't make for an easy answer. But I think it would be useful to sort of draw some lessons from other contexts on how you can design a progressive structure with presumptive taxation.
There is some weather disruption here. The lights kind of blinked out, but if Ajua is not here, I think she may have dropped off. So I'll take over Houston. So I think that's about it. We've gone a little over time, but this was really engaging Q&A conversation, some of the questions and also the suggestions about how we might move forward. I just wanted to also add that what we hope to do is continue to engage with policymakers as we do the work so that we are getting ideas, but also passing on ideas about how together we might figure out this very thorny issue of what is the right way to tax informal workers, and also what's the right way to support them in the work that they are doing. So thank you all, and Ajua is back to have the final word.
Thank you very much, Anikia. Yeah, so sorry, I got cut the internet because of power cuts. So yeah, I think that it's been a very exciting conversation, and we're looking forward to the publications from the research also. You can share with us and then I can distribute among our audience. So this would be the last seminar for the semester, and we will look forward to more seminars from May when the next semester resumes. Thank you very much, Mike, Nanekia, and Florian for the presentation, and thanks everyone again for making time to join us.
Thanks for having us.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.